This is Megadesk. This is very often the system I'm using when I'm streaming or playing games. It's a 7950X3D based around the LiveMixer from ASRock, which I really like. The B650 upgraded to X670 with a special add-in card. You should check out the video on this. It's really something special. I like what ASRock is doing with this motherboard, the LiveMixer series. They're taking a chance. It's got a lot of USB connectivity, but it's not really a lot more extra USB bandwidth. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just the connectivity aspect. The PCIe slots and the connectivity, that's what makes it different. And if you're confused, because it's like, wait a minute, that's the AMD version, I want the Intel version. This has some features that one doesn't have, including embedded DisplayPort. You can add an extra internal display to your system without using one of the 4 external outputs. Yes, that's right. A lot of people on our forum were kind of confused by this. They said, well, I'd love to have a little display inside my system, but my GPU's only got 4 outputs, or it'll only support 4 outputs at a time. Listen, you've got an onboard GPU, an iGPU, an integrated GPU. That's what you ought to be using. That doesn't count against your 4 display limit. If you use the one that's built into the CPU, whether that's Team Red or Team Blue, it's an option. Of course, the AMD, the B650 version of this motherboard, it doesn't have that embedded DisplayPort output, so we've got to do a build. So we got the board, it's time to do a build, right? Well, let's take a look at what you get. I might have skipped a few steps. This is the Lee Dynamic 011. This is a particularly good choice for a build like this, where we're going to utilize that embedded DisplayPort connection. I know everybody is hyped on the hyped case, but look, you could probably save a lot of money DIYing it yourself, and probably end up in a nicer spot, because there's all kinds of embedded DisplayPort displays you can get beyond the embedded DisplayPort kit that ASRock sells, which I don't even have for this build. I just am using an EDP cable in my own panels, because I'm a crazy person. Let's take a quick tour of the board though, because it's got some unique features. I'm starting with the rear I/O. At the rear I/O, it looks like this motherboard is one of the $1,000 class motherboards in terms of I/O, and if you look closely, it'll make a little bit more sense because it's not really $1,000 class I/O, but it does have a lot of actually useful I/O. We've got HDMI and DisplayPort. Those are connected to the built-in CPU connection. We've got 2 USB 2 ports, a super speed 10 gigabit port, and a Type-C port below that. A stack of 4 more USB 2 ports. Then we've got the Ultra Power USB and the Lightning Gaming USB. These are specially routed USB connectors, which may give you a quicker path to the CPU, or will permit more power draw, like if you've got a USB powered amp, something like that. And then we've got 2 more 10 gigabit USB ports, plus our 2.5 gigabit LAN. Now, on the front panel connections, this motherboard also has 2 5 gig connections plus our Type-C connection. And so the difference between the Z690 and the Z790 chipset from Intel was more USB ports. Like, you get 2 more faster USB ports. And it's funny because almost no motherboards that implement Z790 really add a lot more USB over their Z690 counterparts. This motherboard, which is not one of the most expensive Z790 motherboards you can get, actually sort of takes advantage of the extra stuff that the Z790 chipset offers. It's not a lot of difference between the Z690 and Z790, but this board leverages it, which is nice to see. Then we've got analog in and out and our optical SPDIF. So obviously I think ASRock expects you to use a higher end audio solution because this is based around the Realtek 897. It might have been nice to have something a little higher end, but they figure you're probably going to have an external DAC, you're probably going to have an external microphone amplifier. If you're using this for actual live mixing, that is not a bad assumption. The other big thing with this motherboard, other than the PCIe layout, which is very awesome to see, 2 X4 PCIe slots routed to our chipset, plus also the PCIe X1, but it's probably going to be in the way of the GPU, so don't know if we'll count that one, is the M.2 connectivity. There's actually 5 M.2 headers, 6 if you count the Wi-Fi E key, but of the 5, really only 4 are usable. You see, there's a blazing M.2, that's ASRock's name for their PCIe 5 M.2, but that shares connectivity with the X16 slot that is also running at PCIe by 5. So my recommendation is don't really use PCIe 5 storage in general because it's not there yet, but if you do, just be aware that it's going to drop down your PCIe X5 connection, at least according to the manual. I don't have PCIe 5 SSDs to really test this with. You know, the Samsung 980, 990, those are some of the highest performing commodity M.2. You could also use a redriver Gen Z breakout cable with something like the Optane P5800X for enterprise connectivity. If you wanted to connect enterprise grade, you know, U.2 storage devices to this motherboard, those are still going to run at PCIe 4 speeds. And that's underneath this blazing heatsink. So there's actually two M.2 connectors on either side of the heatsink underneath it. One's PCIe 5, one's PCIe 4. Just use the PCIe 4 connection and be happier. Then there's one Hyper M.2 at the midboard that doesn't have a heatsink or anything, and then there's two underneath a modest M.2 heatsink at the bottom of the board. So you got all the M.2 connectivity you could possibly ever use on this board. It's also got 4 SATA ports, so you can rock mechanical storage for bulk storage if you really want. I think 4 is probably the right number. It would have cost more to add more ports, and we're already pushing it as it is. This motherboard uses 4 DDR5 DIMM slots. ASRock says that it supports up to 6800 OC+. I was able to get DDR5 7000 stable, but your mileage may vary, and that was with 2 DIMMs. That was with our G-Skill kit, so your mileage may vary. 6000, 6600, it's a little easier. And actually, the CPU variance is pretty significant. Like one 13900K can do 7000, and the next one can't, even though it's completely stable in all other scenarios. So memory controller is really down to silicon lottery, and if you're hell bent on pushing your memory bandwidth, you're probably going to have to shell out for one of those vastly more expensive boards anyway. Now I've got an AIO in the system right now. Let's add a custom loop instead. Alright, for this build I'm going to kind of Lego some stuff together from good stuff. The P12 Max fans from Arctic. Arctic is making a special appearance in this case. See what I did there? Because they've got the MX5, which is really good for this use case, but I'm going to use this block from EK for LGA 1700. I broke it. Well, the bad news is I broke it. Good news is I guess ASPI strength is returning. We'll have to contact EK and get another one. Now, I broke it earlier, which I'm sure that they'll fix under warranty when I complain about it, so, you know, that's fine. But this is a pretty good block for LGA 1700. It really, if you're going to overclock and do something this extreme, it's worth getting the mounting plate to replace your socket with a mounting plate. You just got to be really careful if you do that, because it'll make your CPU a little bit flatter. And maybe even delidding is an option, but then that gets even more complicated. Maybe let's not do that. Then there's also our bits power radiator. It's thick. Look at that. It's madness. But this thick of a radiator pairs pretty well with the Dynamic 011 because this mounting area here is recessed and offset. It's set back just a little bit. We'll be able to put the fans on the motherboard tray side and the radiator on this side, and these P12 Max fans have really high static pressure, so they are going to shrug off this radiator, no problem. And of course with the CPU, I mean, if you're doing a high-end build like this, 13900K, 13900KS, the best CPU you can get for LGA 1700. I mean, it's 8 P cores and 16 E cores. It's a lot of cores. Too many cores, really, for gaming. I mean, you'd be fine with the 12700 or the 13700. You know, 8 and 8 for gaming would be fine. It's just that those don't tend to be as overclockable as the 13900 series CPU. So, I was also just a little bit surprised that the LiveMixer motherboard could keep up with the 13900KS with its higher 320 watt power limit. That is really pushing the limit of what this motherboard can do. If you're going to be doing a 320 watt, 24/7 OC, you're probably going to have to trade up to a more expensive board. But that's just with the KS. With the 13900K, you're fine. And that's only when you're pushing the 13900KS, even beyond that 320 watts. I mean, it's a lot. I mean, man, these P12 Max fans really are nice. They've got built-in rubber feet for anti-vibration. They'll use up to 1/3 of an amp, so they will ramp to a very high RPM, which is part of the magic of how they do their thing. One minor compatibility note with our bits power radiator is that in the tubes down position, the screw holes don't exactly line up, where they do line up perfectly in the tubes up configuration. You're going to configure the fans for intake. It's going to pull air in from the side because we're going to have that beautiful screen in the front. It's going to be glass, so of course the air comes from the side. It makes sense, and it's going to exhaust out the back and the top. We can also add some fans to the bottom to pull air in from the bottom to help it exhaust out the back and the top as well. We'll see how it goes. Intake fans, go! These Arctic P12 Max, they're really going to do the job for us here. All the heavy lifting. Now remember, if you're going to go to the trouble of building a custom loop, you should just go ahead and get the shim, the processor shim, to make your processor a little flatter than this retention mechanism, because the shim really isn't much cost. If you're using an AIO or a tower cooler or something like that, okay, you probably don't need to do the shim, but you should do the shim. I'm just fresh out of shims. It was not shim 30 in the studio. Well, not too bad if I say so myself, although I'm not going to be able to get our little RGB clip back in there. I've just used it as a threaded screw for now. It's fine. I don't know if it's fine or not. We'll have to run some temperature tests. It's probably fine. And here it is, more or less, our final build around the Z790 LiveMixer. I get it. Everybody's excited about having an LCD screen in your case, but you don't have to buy a bunch of expensive accessories or buy a special case that's designed for an LCD screen. You can DIY it. That's what I did here with the Lee Dynamic 011. Now ASRock makes it easy because their motherboards have that embedded DisplayPort connector, at least some of them.
This is the literal embedded DisplayPort connection.
And if you use the embedded DisplayPort connection, you can get their kit, which includes mounting tape and all kinds of other stuff. I didn't use that. I actually used my own 3D printed stuff. You can find the plans for that at the forum. And so you can print out your own specifically for the Lee Dynamic 011, but it's not super hard to make your own mounts. I did go sort of nuts with this build. I put a custom loop water cooler. In general, I worry about the pump and reservoir being right on top of the GPU, the most expensive component in this. And this is based around the Zotac 4090. Now if you're already screaming at your monitor, you can see that the side's not going to go on with the power supply that's in here. Well, that's not exactly true. The power supply that's in here will work, but I didn't use the right cables. See, you want to use something like the BeQuiet Dark Power 13. This is a new version of the power supply from BeQuiet. We've reviewed them in the past. As far as I can tell, this one's not a lot different. I'm going to work on a full review, but it's got that PCIe 5 connection. So for the 4090, you'll be able to get in there a little closer to the GPU and actually put the side on. That's sort of the design flaw, really, with the 011 Dynamic. It's a nice wide case to give you a lot of room behind the motherboard, but the case itself isn't wide enough for some of these enormous GPUs that we find ourselves with. Of course, this case was designed well before those GPUs, so can't fault Der Bauer or Lee for that. You can make it work in this setup, and I think for what I've got planned for this build, it's going to work. Worst case scenario, you could just get a right angle PCIe 5 connection. It's the low profile connector that had a little bit of a kerfuffle because it wanted to catch on fire sort of randomly, but I think that's behind us now, finally, hopefully, fingers crossed. This is also an 850 watt power supply, which is a little below what you would run if you're going to run a 13900K or a KS plus the 4090. So, maybe go for the 1000 watt version or something like that, but this is the box that I had handy. But that'll work great for our build. For storage, for right now, I'm rocking a Samsung 990 Pro. It's the fastest non-Optane storage that you can get right now for all-around performance. And because of the glut of flash memory, you can pick up the 990 for around 150 US, give or take. It's a great deal. It's a great deal for what it is. For a monitor, this is the ASRock Phantom Gaming 3440 by 1440 is the resolution. It's a very high refresh rate monitor. And so this makes a pretty awesome high-end gaming build. If you're wondering what the keyboard is, it's the new Beam Spring keyboard. It's a keyboard that's a very, very old mechanism. It's very hipster. It's not for everybody, but it's interesting. And then for the mouse, we've got just a standard issue wireless Logitech mouse. Purple, of course, is the color scheme because it has to be, because LiveMixer. I mean, ASRock's even doing something different with their color schemes here, so I don't know, fun times. If you wanted to add your GPU to a custom loop, you got something like the ASRock 7900 XTX Aqua, which I'll be doing a review on separately. You could add it to this build easily, but I didn't have any extra quick release fittings, so I couldn't put it together so I could quickly put in the 7900 XTX and take it out and put it in and take it out, because that 7900 XTX is actually going to go on my Threadripper Pro system. Can't wait for that, because I've got a Pro distribution block and some other fun stuff, so I'm really excited about that. Other than that, there's not really anything special about this build. One thing missing from this build is I need to add 2 exhaust fans to the top. Probably 120 millimeter. I might try a 140 to see if I can get it in there. But I need something other than the 3 fans on the side that's pulling air into this system. I mean, those 3 fans are good for the radiator, but I want a little bit more air circulation in this case, especially if I can get the side on. The fans in the top will help pull fresh air in from the bottom for the GPU. If I don't ever actually figure out a way to get the side on, or if I get it mounted, I mean, I've tried the cable and it fits, but yeah, it's still kind of a tight fit. I'm going to add the fans to the bottom instead of the top so that this thing will still get pretty good airflow, even when the side of the computer is not on. Of course, I guess the GPU is going to get fresh air with the side off anyway, but you know, we can help it and give it a little bit of a push. There's one extra set of 3.5-inch mechanical bays at the back here. You could put in a second power supply if you want. So things like the Asus Z790 chipset, which is actually why I had this case handy, because I expected to use one of the dual power supply motherboards with the new Z790 workstation motherboards. And this case has the foresight to have the option of mounting 2 power supplies in it for motherboards that require 2 power supplies, like the EVGA SR3 Dark for, remember, 3647. You know, W790 has come of age, but that's going to be a future video. For now, this is the ASRock Z790 LiveMixer. This is a great build. I could not be happier with how this turned out, and I really want to drive home. If you want an LCD screen inside your computer, you're probably going to be happier if you DIY it instead of buying a bunch of expensive accessories. Just saying. You can actually harvest these out of old laptops. It's got to be an EDP display, and the tricky part is finding the cable that'll go from the motherboard to the display. The easy button, of course, is to just get ASRock's kit, which comes with the LCD screen and mounting tape and the cable that you need for their motherboards. All their motherboards have the same connector, but it is an industry standard connector. You can get different screens on eBay, which I did. Alright, I'm Modelless Level 1. This has been a quickie Level 1 build with our Z790 LiveMixer. I'm signing out, and if you have any questions or you want me to try anything or whatever, I'll be in the forum. Catch you later.